Hundreds of Tunisians marched in the capital on Saturday to protest against police abuse they say is endangering freedoms that were won in 2011. There have been nearly daily protests since mid-January, the anniversary of Tunisia's revolution that sparked uprisings across the region, known as the Arab Spring. Protests flared earlier this month on the 10th anniversary of Tunisia's 2011 revolution that inspired the Arab Spring and introduced democracy in the North African country. Police have arrested more than 1,000 people during demonstrations over the past 2 weeks. At least one person died in the central city of Sbaitla last week, which his family blamed on his being hit by a tear gas canister. To try and understand what is at the core of this current unrest, we're now joined via Zoom by Ebrahim Deen, who is a researcher at the Thinktank Afro-Middle East Centre. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
The pleasure is all mine. Thanks so much, Peter. Compliments of the season.
Yes, complaints of the season to you as well. So 2011, I remember this Arab Spring like it was just the other day. Nobody could have predicted just how far and wide this was going to end up. We saw Egypt and Libya and other places fall, inverted commas. What has happened 10 years later that on the anniversary of this uprising, that similar types of dissatisfaction are being expressed on the streets?
I think the big issue with the Arab Spring is, in Arab uprisings, and specifically Tunisia, the biggest issue for me it was the fact that there was no freedoms and there was no economic growth. And people were willing to take the lack of freedoms if there was economic growth. Now, what has happened in the past 10 years is there is political freedoms. Tunisia has seen numerous changes of government in 2011, 2013. There's at least 4 changes of government, and 4 democratically elected processes that occurred. But what has happened in Tunisia is that, unlike in many other countries, there is no dominant party. And because there was no dominant party, it actually meant that there has been economic stalemate. Because one, there's no dominant party, and two is, the powerful labor union and business federation has actually stunted the process of actually real economic reform. And this has meant that, the unemployment is now more than it was in 2011. The economic conditions are worse than they were in 2011. And I think that's significant in the fact that, the coronavirus meant that, much of the industry, the country's industries had to close last year. Also, tourism, which is a mainstay of the country's economy, was severely impacted by corona. And we're not even then looking at Libya and Algeria, its 2 neighbors. So, these issues have meant that economically the country is far worse off. Unemployment, youth unemployment in some places sits at 40%, 45%. And that's what's happened. That's what led to these protests. Now, as many are saying that the protests are only so big because of the fact that there's so much freedom. There were 6,500 protests last year in Tunisia. But, these economic issues are actually leading to this nostalgia for, the early 2000s. And, when we look at the polling, we see, the most popular parties being those who want to reverse the gains of the uprisings.
So the current president won a landslide victory in 2019. And unfortunately for him, as you say, COVID-19 happened almost 10 minutes later. So his hands were tied, I guess, but they gave him a landslide victory. Is there no giving him some leeway, given that the whole globe is under pressure?
I think the big issue is that the youth are very restive. If you look at the older populations, they still want to give him a chance. But, when we look at Qais' side, Tunisia's system is a parliamentary system. Yes, the president, there are some powers in foreign policy. But the bigger issues and the real domestic issues are driven by a prime minister. The current prime minister, was only, it took a good 5 months before he was elected. The dominant party, the largest party in the country's electoral process, just had about 25% of the vote. So, we can already see there's a lack of political consensus in the country. And this political consensus means that there isn't, coupled with Corona, coupled with the powerful trade union movement, means that they can't actually have any real structural economic reform. And this is meaning that there's less jobs now. I mean, the bigger issue though is even with economic reform, the job situation is not just going to improve now. That takes time to happen. So, that is leading to many youth saying that corruption is rife, that they have to be close to the elite to have power. And that's why, there's these big protests, and not helped by the fact that, there's now 1,000 protesters that have been arrested in the past 2 2 weeks. And, the police's response has been, heavy-handed in the sense that they have used tear gas in it, but, there has not been any live ammunition in it. So, that is a significant part, is that the police have had some restraint. But, obviously, with the large amount of protesters, there have been injuries and deaths, and that actually just spur on the protests further.
The longer this goes on, what does that mean for the Tunisian authorities?
They've called for the Prime Minister to step down, the dominant party, Nahda has. But the dominant party only has 25% of the vote. The Prime Minister himself doesn't have much influence, much power. The big issue, though, is, previously in Tunisia, when there was a threat to the uprising itself, the political forces generally, came together and actually issued or came up with processes, even though it was more veneer rather than actual change. But, there was something that the main political forces, the UGT, the trade union, basically the labor federation, the business federation, doesn't seem that is not seeming to be the case at the moment. So, there is this current, in a sense, inertia and the inability to actually undertake or implement any policy that would actually result in significant change and quick change. And I think the big issue, though, is if something, or if the crisis in Libya can get solved a bit quicker, that may actually give the government some time, because Libya is Tunisia's largest trading partner. So regional issues, probably if the situation changes, that may allow some space. But, that these economic issues are tough policies that need to be implemented. And unfortunately, there's a lack of political will, lack of political consensus, and in a sense, an inability to implement these policies because of this very fragmented political system.
All right. Yeah, you've mentioned Libya, and I was just actually going to go there. That are there lessons learned there? Because there's all this euphoria about a post-Gaddafi era, but what was left on the ground actually was quite a fractured society. And I wonder if that hasn't played out as well in Tunisia then.
I think not so much, in the sense that, unlike Libya, Tunisia's, the political system is a lot more mature. The main party, Nahda, is actually a much more, has been longer since its founding. It's a longer period of time. Rashid Ghannouchi, the head of Nahda, is actually, very, very strategic and a very smart person. Academic who, previously wrote on these political parties. So, I think there are differences. The country, has a very strong labor union, very strong secular tendency, and so there's differences between Tunisia and Libya. There's more binaries, in a sense, in Tunisia than there was in Libya, but I think more significantly in Tunisia, and that means the fragmentation is more entrenched. But different to Libya, in Tunisia, the political forces don't hold arms. The army is also pretty weak, so there is no resort to violence, in a sense. The stalemate, because of the fragmentation, actually plays out politically and plays out in the fact that there's no real economic policy that's been implemented. It doesn't necessarily become violent. And what we are seeing in Tunisia, unlike Libya, is this nostalgia for the past, and the fact that, in the polls, the Free Desturian Party is actually the highest in the polls, shows that even if there is going to be a reversal or change, it will be done democratically, in a sense, rather than via violent means. So, the fragmentation is an issue, but because there is no, the parties don't seem to want to involve the military and don't possess any military capacity. The fragmentation that is occurring is playing out in the political arena and through civil society.
All right. You talk about nostalgia of the past. Are there any lasting vestiges of the Zine El Abidine Ben Ali era?
Yes, there's a few. One is the Free Desturian Party, party that actually doesn't recognize the Arab uprisings and basically says that, they need Ben Ali's period was the best in time, and that that the society needs to be moved back to that period. And also the labor unions. The labor union under Ben Ali was one of the key cogs of his influence, and the leadership remains, very similar to what it was during his period, and that has acted to stunt change. And also, there's been very little reform in terms of trying to reduce or trying to reverse or have more progressive taxation on the wealth of the elite. So those vestiges are still there, and that, coupled with the lack of a dominant party, in a sense, actually has caused this fragmentation. It means that Tunisia is not necessarily moving forward.
All right. So look, we're not going to see another Arab Spring. It all started in Tunisia, but the longer this goes on, this kind of protest expression, could we see some contagion in the region, in other parts where there's also similar dissatisfaction?
The big issue would be, if we're looking for contagion, is Lebanon. But, occurrences in Lebanon is very different to that in Tunisia, right? And actually what we have seen in the past 2 years, we've seen, a transition in Sudan, a more democratic transition in Sudan, attempted transition in Algeria. So we are seeing, movements of people want more say in governance. But the difference in, between most of these countries in Tunisia is that Tunisia is a democratic country. And, the Qais side can legitimately say he's, one of the most democratic leaders, or really the only democratically elected leader in the region. So, and that's a big difference, and that ensures that even though there's large protests, there's not necessarily calls for the fall of the government. There's calls for the government to take different and more steps, and that shows, that much of the people still want these democratic these democratic values and these democratic procedures to be protected.
All right. Ebrahim Deen, always good talking to you. Thank you so much indeed. Your insights always greatly appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
All right. That's Ebrahim Deen speaking to us about the situation in Tunisia. 4 days now of protests, people unhappy with massive unemployment and economic stagnation. And some nostalgia being felt for a period before. 2011, of course, the Arab Spring saw Tunisia move from the Ben Ali era, but it looks as if life is pretty hard for the average Tunisian.